and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading it loud and clear.
Roger all, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there and Bravo.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the December 19, 2018 edition of Space News, our last episode for the year. Once again, this is Peter Railwood, and Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia with me are from the Space Association. Good evening, gentlemen.
G'day, Pete. How you going?
Great.
Good evening, guys, and hello, world.
Well, we're going to start off again in Australia. There's more good Australian space news happening, which has been fantastic. Finally, the announcement we all have been waiting for. The Australian Space Agency will be located in Adelaide, reinforcing South Australia's long-standing contribution to the nation's space journey. Formally making the announcement last week, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said South Australia was a key hub for innovation and the technology industry, making it the ideal home for the new space agency. Our government's $41 million investment into the agency will act as a launching pad to triple Australia's space economy to $12 billion and create up to 20,000 jobs by 2030, he said. The agency, to be located at Lot 14 at the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site, is also key to the new Adelaide City deal, with a memorandum of understanding signed by the Prime Minister and South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall, aimed at turbocharging Adelaide's economy and driving long-term investment in the city. South Australia is already home to more than 60 organisations and 800 employees in the space sector, and this decision builds on a very strong technology and defence presence in the state, Minister Andrews said. The Australian Space Agency will be located in Adelaide by mid-2019 and is set to employ 20 full-time staff in that city. And more regional space news, Rocket Lab launches its Electron rocket into orbit carrying 13 satellites for the US Space Agency NASA from its launch pad in New Zealand. The mission was the small satellite launch company's second commercial flight and the first in partnership with NASA. The launch was at a significant moment for the industry, as it marked the first time that NASA had booked a ride for its CubeSats on a commercial launch vehicle, Rocket Lab said in a statement. Rocket Lab's 17-metre Electron rocket lifted off from the world's first privately owned orbital launch site on the Mahai Peninsula of New Zealand's North Island, early Sunday evening Australian time. The US company with facilities in New Zealand wants to remove barriers to commercial space by providing frequent launch opportunities, aiming for weekly launches for commercial clients. And it's over to you, Angelo.
Thanks, Peter. Across to the United States. In his final weeks in Congress, Senator Bill Nelson, Democrat Florida, says he'll still seek to extend operations of the International Space Station. In a speech in the Senate early last week, Nelson said he's working with Senator Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, to win passage of legislation containing language extending the authorization of the International Space Station through to 2030. Cruz and Nelson introduced a bill this past northern summer that included such a provision that is awaiting action by the full Senate. Nelson, who lost his bid for a fourth term last month, said his remarks would be his final Senate floor speech on space, and he used them to reflect on the accomplishments of NASA and the commercial space industry during his time in Congress. Talking about the space station, let's talk about it. Russian cosmonauts identified the site of a leak on a Soyuz spacecraft during a long and at times dramatic spacewalk last week. Oleg Kononenko and Sergei Prokopyev spent 7 hours and 45 minutes outside the station, spending the first few hours moving over to the Soyuz MS-09 spacecraft. Cosmonauts then cut through the insulation surrounding part of the spacecraft's orbital module, including using a knife that scattered flakes of material all around them. Interesting picture if you get a hold of that one. They did find the site of the hole, which caused an air leak briefly in August until cosmonauts patched it up internally with epoxy. The spacewalkers collected materials for analysis back on Earth before wrapping up the EVA. The Soyuz spacecraft will depart the station on December 20 to return 3 crew members to Earth, but the orbital module where the hole is located will be jettisoned before re-entry. Michael.
Okay, let's look at NASA Lunar and Planetary. NASA's InSight Mars lander has completed that all-important milestone, its first selfie. The picture of the lander, released early last week, is a mosaic of 11 images taken by a camera on the lander's robotic arm, which was raised up to look down on the lander. The lander has also taken images of the surface around it as part of efforts to locate where to place its 2 main instruments, a seismometer and a heat flow probe. Scientists said that they were pleased by the lack of rocks and other surface features that might have posed difficulties for those instruments. NASA's InSight Mars lander has captured the sounds of wind on Mars. The seismometer on the spacecraft detected vibrations created when the wind passed over the spacecraft's 2 large solar panels. The rumbling is at the lower end of the human hearing range. Scientists described the detection as an unplanned treat from the seismometer, which will be placed onto the surface of the planet in the coming months. It will then be covered with a shield to prevent it from detecting wind noises in order to better detect the planet's seismic activity. And Voyager 2 has joined its twin spacecraft in interstellar space. NASA announced last week that the 41-year-old spacecraft passed the heliopause, the boundary between the bubble of space dominated by the solar wind and the surrounding interstellar medium last month. Voyager 1, on a different trajectory out of the solar system, crossed the heliopause back in 2012. Voyager's project manager said at a briefing that the 2 spacecraft remain in good health but face dwindling power as their nuclear power sources decay. The spacecraft may be able to continue operating for as long as another decade. And NASA's OSIRIS-REx spacecraft has detected evidence of water on the asteroid Bennu. Project scientists said last week that the spacecraft, which formally arrived at the asteroid a week earlier, had detected hydrated minerals on the asteroid's surface. That suggests that the hypothesized larger asteroid that Bennu is a remnant of had liquid water in its interior. Scientists also said that the shape of the asteroid matched their expectations based on earlier radar observations, but that its surface contained far more boulders than anticipated. Meanwhile, the New Horizons spacecraft is zeroing in on the Kuiper Belt object it will fly by at the end of the month. The spacecraft corrected its trajectory recently to put it on course to fly within 3,500 kilometres of the object 2014 MU-69, also known as Ultima Thule, on New Year's Day 2019. The object is clearly visible in images taken by the spacecraft. As the spacecraft approaches Ultima Thule, the project is offering people the opportunity to beam a message in the direction of the spacecraft on January 1st, after its closest approach to the object. Okay, let's have a look at China. China's Chang'e 4 spacecraft has entered lunar orbit. The China Lunar Exploration Project announced that the spacecraft performed a successful orbital insertion burn, going into orbit around the Moon early last week. Controllers will later adjust that orbit, an elliptical one with a low point about 100 kilometres above the surface, in the coming days, as well as a test communications with a satellite that will serve as a relay when Chang'e 4 is on the far side of the moon. Chang'e 4 is expected to attempt a landing on the lunar far side, likely within the 186-kilometre diameter von Karman crater early next month. And moving to India. The Indian Space Agency, ISRO, plans to use the upper stage from an upcoming launch for in-space experiments. Once the upper stage from a Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, or PSLV, launched in January deploys its payload, the stage will serve as a platform for experiments equipped with batteries and a solar panel. The stage could operate for up to 6 months, and if this test is successful, ISRO may offer payload space on future upper stages to students or researchers. Angelo.
Okay, let's look at SpaceX. A proposed wall along the Mexican border could pose a problem for a SpaceX launch site. SpaceX said last week that Customs and Border Protection, part of the Department of Homeland Security, has asked permission to conduct a survey on SpaceX's property near Brownsville, where the company is building a launch site. That property is on the Gulf of Mexico coast, just north of the Mexican border. The company said it's in talks with DHS to further understand their plans. Interesting. All right, Peter.
All right, Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two flew to the edge of space for the first time last week. The vehicle, named USS Unity, took off from the Mojave Air and Spaceport attached to its White Knight 2 carrier aircraft. Spaceship 2 separated from White Knight 2 and fired its hybrid rocket motor for 60 seconds. The vehicle reached a peak altitude of nearly 83 kilometres and a top speed of Mach 2.9 before gliding back to Mojave. Virgin Galactic declared the flight a success and called its first space flight, noting that it exceeded the altitude of 50 miles used by the US government agencies to award astronaut wings, even though it did not reach the 100-kilometre Kármán line. Besides testing the performance of the vehicle, Spaceship Two carried experiments for NASA's Flight Opportunities Program. And Virgin Galactic's founder Richard Branson says he expects to fly in space next year on the first commercial Spaceship Two flight. Branson, speaking after the test flight last week, said he thought as few as 3 more test flights would be needed before operations shift to New Mexico's Spaceport America, where commercial flights will take place. Sometime next year, once the testing is finished, then I'll do my flight, he said. He added that Virgin would soon start selling tickets again after a 4-year hiatus with slightly higher prices. Branson said he estimated Virgin has spent as much as $1.5 billion in its space efforts, which include a small launch company, Virgin Orbit, and spacecraft manufacturer, the Spaceship Company. And finally, commander of the Apollo 8 mission, which we celebrate the 50th anniversary this month, has donated some of his memorabilia to an aircraft museum. The Borman Collection exhibit opened at the Experimental Aircraft Association's museum in Wisconsin recently, featuring items donated by former astronaut Frank Borman. The items include a spacesuit helmet worn by Borman on the Gemini 7 mission and a hand controller from the Apollo 8 spacecraft used to manually fire the vehicle. Borman donated more than 1,000 items from his personal collection to the museum, a small fraction of which are now on display. And interesting, I was reading about Borman, and he actually never really, once he'd done his mission, Apollo 8, and got around the moon, he felt they'd won the space race, and he was not interested in going back to the moon and walking on it, unlike many of his other buddies, including Jim Lovell, and we all know what happened to him. Anyway, that is the final space show for 2018, and I'd like to thank Michael and Angelo for all their hard work, and we will see you all, or we will speak to you all in our first show in February. Back to you, Andrew.